They thought they broke you. They watched you go quiet, watched you stop reaching out, stop explaining yourself, stop showing up the way you always did. And they told themselves they won. They assumed your silence was defeat. They mistook your stillness for surrender. And that is the most expensive mistake they will ever make, because you were never breaking. You were becoming. And there is a difference between those two things that most people will never understand until it is far too late for them to do anything about it. You were not like everyone else. You never were. While other people move through relationships casually, keeping things surface level, investing just enough to get by, you were doing something entirely different. You were going all in every single time with every single person you chose to let close. You did not do half measures. You did not do casual. When you cared about someone, you cared about them completely, their moods, their struggles, their silences, their potential. You carried all of it. Not because anyone asked you to, but because that is simply how you are built. Your nervous system registers other people's pain the way most people register their own. That is not a flaw. That is a form of depth that the average person will never fully comprehend. But depth without protection is dangerous, and for a long time you had no protection. You had only openness. You walked into relationships like open doors. Anyone could come through, take what they needed, leave a mess, and walk back out. And you let them, not because you were naive, but because you genuinely believed that if you gave enough, if you were patient enough, if you loved consistently enough, eventually things would even out. Eventually the effort would be returned. Eventually the people you chose would rise to meet you where you were. That belief was not stupidity, it was hope. And hope is not a weakness, but it can become one when it is used against you by people who recognize it and exploit it. Here is what nobody talks about when they talk about empaths: the accumulation. Not the final breaking point, not the dramatic moment of silence or withdrawal, but the slow, invisible buildup that happens long before any of that. Every time someone dismissed what you said, you registered it and said nothing. Every time someone made a promise and quietly failed to keep it, you registered it and made excuses for them. Every time your effort was met with indifference, your vulnerability was met with disinterest, your love was met with inconsistency, you registered all of it. You stored it. Not consciously, not as a list of grievances, but as a growing weight. A pressure behind everything. A quiet knowing that something was wrong even when you could not yet name what it was. And because you are who you are, you did not respond to that pressure the way most people would. You did not get defensive. You did not retaliate. You did not create distance as a form of self-protection. Instead, you leaned in. You communicated more. You tried harder. You became more patient, more understanding, more accommodating, because somewhere inside you, you believed that the solution to being undervalued was to become more valuable. That if you just made yourself easier to love, more available, more giving, the dynamic would shift. It did not shift. It calcified. Because what you did not yet understand was that your willingness to absorb, to adapt, to stay was being read as permission. Not consciously perhaps, but functionally. Your presence without boundaries taught people that they could behave without consequences, that you would stay regardless, that your love was unconditional in a way that made accountability unnecessary. And so the dynamic deepened. The imbalance grew. You gave more, they expected more. You forgave quickly, they apologized less. You showed up consistently, they became increasingly careless. And through all of it, you kept telling yourself variations of the same story. They are going through something. They did not mean it that way. This is a rough patch. It will improve. Those stories were not lies. They came from a real place of compassion. But compassion without discernment eventually becomes self-betrayal. And you are betraying yourself in slow motion, one rationalization at a time, without even realizing it was happening. There is a line, and it is a line most people cannot see from the outside, between endurance and self-erasure. Endurance is conscious. It is chosen. It has a purpose and a limit. Self-erasure is different. It is what happens when you have overridden your own signals so many times that you stop hearing them clearly. When your discomfort no longer registers as a warning, it just registers as normal. You had crossed that line without realizing it. You had normalized treatment that should have been unacceptable from the very beginning. And the most painful part of that is not what they did to you. The most painful part is that you participated in it out of love, out of loyalty, out of a deep and genuine belief that people deserve more chances than they had earned. But here is what was quietly happening underneath all of that endurance, underneath all of that patience and giving and rationalizing. You were recording everything, every moment of being undervalued, every time your emotional needs were treated as inconveniences, Every instance where you showed up fully and were met with half, you were not letting it go. You were not as unbothered as you appeared. You were building something, not a case against them, not a plan for revenge, but an understanding. A slow, cellular level understanding of exactly who these people were, what they were capable of, and what they truly thought of you. And that understanding, once it reached a certain mass, was going to change everything. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely and permanently in ways that no apology would ever be able to undo. That is where your story really begins. Not at the moment they hurt you, but at the moment you finally, clearly, without any emotional static or interference, saw them for exactly what they were. There is a moment that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with anger or tears or confrontation. It does not feel the way you imagined it would back when you used to imagine finally reaching your limit. It is quieter than that, more internal. It happens in an ordinary moment, a regular conversation, a familiar disappointment, a pattern repeating itself for what you will later recognize was the last time, and something inside you simply stops negotiating. Not dramatically, not with fanfare. It just stops. And once it stops, it does not start again. That is the moment everything changed for you, not the moment you were hurt. The moment you finally, completely, without reservation, believed what the evidence had been telling you for a very long time. Before that moment, you were operating under a set of quiet assumptions that you did not even realize you held. That people are fundamentally trying their best. That inconsistency is usually a symptom of circumstances, not character. That if you explain yourself clearly enough, patiently enough, compassionately enough, understanding will eventually follow. These assumptions were not foolish. They were extensions of how you yourself move through the world. You try your best. Your inconsistency, when it happens, is circumstantial. You respond to clarity and compassion. And so you projected that same internal architecture onto people who are built entirely differently, who are operating from a completely different set of values, and who had shown you repeatedly and without ambiguity exactly who they were. You kept rewriting what you saw because you could not reconcile their behavior with the version of them you had chosen to believe in. You were not in a relationship with who they were. You were in a relationship with who you believed they could become. That is one of the heaviest realizations an empath ever carries. That the love was real, the effort was real, the hope was real, but the person you were directing all of it toward was, in large part, a story you had written yourself. You filled in their gaps with your own generosity. You interpreted their silences with your own emotional intelligence. You gave their careless moments the benefit of every doubt until the benefit ran out and there was nothing left to give. And the day that finally landed not as an idea but as a felt truth in your body was the day your entire internal landscape shifted. Not because something new happened, because you finally stopped explaining away something old. Clarity is a strange experience when it arrives after a long period of confusion. It does not feel like relief at first. It feels like loss. Because clarity removes the story, and the story was the thing that made the relationship bearable. The story was what kept you invested, kept you hopeful, kept you reaching. When clarity dissolves the story, what remains is just the bare, unpadded reality of what was actually happening, and that reality is often much simpler and much colder than anything you allowed yourself to fully see before. They were not confused. They were not overwhelmed. They were not temporarily distracted or going through something that explained the pattern. The pattern was the point. The inconsistency was not accidental. It was habitual, and habits reveal character in a way that isolated incidents never can. Once you saw that, truly saw it, without the emotional cushioning, without the rationalization, something remarkable happened. The urgency left you. That frantic, exhausting internal urgency that had been driving you to communicate more clearly, to try harder, to find the right words, the right timing, the right approach, it simply dissolved. Because urgency is powered by hope. And hope in this context had finally met reality and quietly stepped aside. What replaced it was not despair. It was something far more composed than despair. It was stillness, an eerie, clarifying stillness that comes when you stop fighting the truth and simply let it be true. And in that stillness, your behavior began to change, not as a strategy, not as a performance, not as a way of sending a message. It changed because you changed. You stopped over-explaining because you no longer believed that explanation would produce understanding in someone who had repeatedly demonstrated they were not interested in understanding you. You stopped reaching out first because the reaching had never created the reciprocity you needed. It had only created the illusion of connection while masking a profound absence of it. You stopped softening your edges to make others comfortable because you finally recognized that their comfort had been built on your compression on how small you were willing to make yourself so that they would not have to confront their own inadequacy. This is the part that the people who hurt you completely misread. They saw the change in you and interpreted it through the only framework they had available to them, their own. And within their framework, when someone pulls back, it means they are wounded. When someone goes quiet, it means they can be coaxed back with the right gesture. When someone stops reaching, it means they are waiting to be pursued, that they are playing a game, that they are trying to elicit a reaction. They watched you change and thought they understood what they were seeing. They did not. What they were seeing was not a wounded person waiting to be rescued. What they were seeing was a person who had finished processing, and processing, once complete, does not reverse. What you were experiencing on the inside was something they would never have the emotional vocabulary to recognize from the outside. You were not detaching from them. You were reattaching to yourself. Every bit of energy that had been flowing outward toward managing their emotions, filling their silences, compensating for their absences, translating their inconsistency into something you could live with was now flowing back inward. And it was filling something that had been running on empty for longer than you had admitted to yourself. You were not going cold. You were getting warm in places that had been neglected and quiet and waiting for you to come back to them. You were returning to your own instincts, your own voice, your own sense of what was acceptable and what was not, your own read on situations which had been accurate far earlier than you had trusted it to be. And as you returned to those things, something began to solidify inside you. Not hardness, not bitterness, structure. A quiet, unannounced, deeply personal structure that would, from this point forward, determine what got access to you and what did not. You were not building walls. You were building standards. And standards are not the same as walls, because walls keep everything out, but standards let the right things through while holding the wrong things at the boundary where they belong. They thought your silence meant you were finished. They were half right. You were finished, but not in the way they imagined. You were not finished in the way of someone who has given up. You were finished in the way of someone who has finally, completely, without any remaining ambiguity, made up their mind. There is a particular kind of power that nobody warns you about. Not the loud kind, not the power of confrontation, of ultimatums, of finally saying everything you held back for so long. That kind of power is real, but it is also temporary because it still requires the other person's reaction to feel complete. The kind of power you developed was different. It was quieter, more self-contained, and infinitely more durable. It was the power of someone who no longer needed anything from the people who had taken everything. And when you stopped needing from them, you stopped being controllable by them. That shift, that single structural shift in what you required from people who had proven themselves incapable of providing it, was the moment the dynamic between you and every person who had ever underestimated you changed forever. The people who hurt you had a model of you in their minds. Most people do this. They build a working model of the people in their lives based on patterns of behavior, and then they operate according to that model rather than paying attention to the actual person in front of them. Their model of you was built on a very specific and very consistent pattern. You absorb, you rationalize, you stay. You get hurt, you process it internally, you come back softer. You withdraw slightly, they offer something minimal, a partial explanation, a moment of warmth, a gesture that costs them very little, and you return because your capacity for hope always slightly outpaced your memory of pain. That was the cycle. And they had learned it, not consciously perhaps, but functionally. They knew on some level that there was always a way back in with you, that the door was never truly closed, that your love was the kind that forgave before it was even asked to. But the model they had of you was built on an older version of you, a version that no longer existed. And when they reached for the familiar levers, the apology that used to work, the warmth that used to soften you, the explanation that used to buy more time, they found that nothing responded the way it used to. Not because you were performing distance, not because you were making them suffer deliberately, but because the internal architecture they had learned to navigate had been completely rebuilt. The doors they knew how to open no longer existed. The buttons they knew how to press were no longer connected to anything. You were not the same person they had practiced on. And they did not know what to do with that, because the one thing they had never prepared for was you becoming someone they did not have a strategy for. This is what emotional detachment actually looks like from the inside, and it is nothing like what people assume. People assume detachment means numbness, that you have gone cold, that you have closed yourself off, that some essential part of you has shut down in response to pain. But that is not what happened to you. What happened was the opposite of shutdown. Your emotions did not disappear. They clarified. The emotional static that had been clouding your perception for so long, the hope, the confusion, the persistent wondering whether you were being too sensitive or not sensitive enough, whether you were asking too much or accepting too little, all of that cleared. And what was left was clean signal, direct, uncomplicated perception with no interference from wishful thinking. You could see people clearly now, not harshly, not with contempt, but accurately. And accuracy after a long period of distortion feels almost surreal. You began to notice things you had been too emotionally invested to notice before. You noticed who reached out only when they needed something and disappeared when they did not. You noticed who offered warmth conditionally as a tool of management rather than a genuine expression of care. You noticed the difference between people who were in your life and people who were simply using the space your life provided. And because you could see these things clearly, without the blur of hope distorting your vision, you could make different choices. Not angry choices, not reactive choices, quiet, deliberate, permanent choices about where your energy was going and who it was going toward. What you discovered in this phase surprised you. You had expected that pulling back would feel like loss, like shrinking, like loneliness. And there was some of that in the early days because any restructuring carries grief. But underneath the grief was something you had not anticipated, relief, a profound physical bone-level relief that came from no longer carrying weight that was never yours to carry. For so long you had been maintaining relationships almost entirely on your own efforts, sustaining them, repairing them, keeping them alive through sheer force of emotional labor. And when you stopped doing that work, when you let things settle at whatever level they naturally settled without your constant intervention, you discovered that many of the connections you had been desperately trying to preserve were not actually connections at all. They were performances, and they required your participation to continue. Without it, they simply stopped. Not because you ended them, because they had never truly existed beyond your willingness to hold them up. That realization did not make you bitter. It made you precise. Precision is what replaces overextension in someone who is genuinely healed rather than simply hardened. You did not become someone who trusts no one. You became someone who pays attention before trusting. You did not become someone who gives nothing. You became someone who gives deliberately to people who have demonstrated they know what to do with what you offer. You did not close yourself off from connection. You raised the standard for what connection actually means, and in doing so, you made space for something real that the noise of one-sided relationships had been drowning out for years. Your silence during this period communicated more than anything you had ever said out loud. And the people who felt it the most were the ones who had relied most heavily on your endless availability. They had mistaken your openness for a permanent condition rather than a choice. They had taken your consistency for granted the way you take oxygen for granted, not thinking about it, not valuing it, simply assuming it would always be there. And when it was no longer automatically there, when they reached for it and found only distance, they experienced something that was entirely new to them in the context of their relationship with you. They experienced consequence, not punishment. You were not punishing anyone, but the natural, inevitable consequence of treating someone's care as an entitlement rather than a gift. The consequence of taking so much for so long that eventually there was a reckoning. And here is what the reckoning looked like from your side. It looked like peace. You were not angry. You were not plotting. You were not sitting somewhere rehearsing what you would say when they finally came to you. You were simply living more quietly, more intentionally, more in alignment with yourself than you had been in longer than you could clearly remember. The war was over, not because someone surrendered, because you had stopped fighting a battle that was never going to produce the outcome you needed. You had stepped off the battlefield and walked in a completely different direction. And the most disorienting part for them was that you did not look back, because someone who has truly reclaimed themselves does not need the acknowledgement of the people who failed to value them. Validation from the source of your wound is not healing, it is re-entry. And you were done re-entering spaces that had cost you your sense of self. You had paid that price long enough. You had funded other people's emotional comfort with your own well-being for long enough. And now the account was closed not in anger, not in ceremony, but in the quiet, unshakable way of someone who has simply moved on to something more worthy of everything they have to give. You were not broken. You were restructured. And the version of you that emerged from that restructuring was something none of them had ever encountered before, because it was something you had never fully been before, completely, unapologetically, immovably yourself. Here's the truth they will never say out loud, because saying it would require a level of self-awareness that the people who hurt you have consistently demonstrated they do not possess. They built you, not intentionally, not generously, not with any desire to see you become more powerful, more grounded, more precisely yourself. They built you through carelessness, through neglect, through the slow, grinding pressure of being underestimated so many times that you were eventually forced to excavate something in yourself that comfort and reciprocity might never have uncovered. Every dismissal was a chisel. Every broken promise was a hammer. Every moment they treated your depth like an inconvenience was, without their knowledge, without their consent, and entirely against their intention, a contribution to the architecture of who you are now. They were not trying to make you stronger, but they did. And that is the irony they will, and carry without ever fully understanding it. There is a specific kind of growth that only becomes possible after a specific kind of pain. Not the clean pain of loss or grief, where something ends and you mourn it and move forward, but the particular prolonged pain of being present in something that was slowly, quietly, consistently taking more than it gave and staying anyway, because you believed in it, because you invested in it, because walking away felt like failure when really it was the only honest response available. That kind of pain does something to a person that no seminar, no book, no comfortable relationship ever could. It burns away everything that was not essential, every people-pleasing instinct that was rooted in fear rather than genuine care, every habit of self-abandonment dressed up as loyalty, every pattern of shrinking yourself to fit spaces that were never designed to hold someone of your actual size. When you came through that fire, what remained was not a diminished version of you. It was the most accurate version of you that had ever existed, refined, clarified, stripped of the softness that had been exploited and left with the softness that was genuinely yours, the kind that comes from strength rather than appeasement. You are not who you were when this started. And you need to understand that clearly, not as a loss, but as the most significant gain of your life. The version of you that existed before knew how to love deeply, but it did not yet know how to love wisely. It did not know the difference between real connection and the performance of connection. It did not know how to distinguish between people who valued your presence and people who valued your function. It did not know how to hold its own emotional needs with the same tenderness it extended to everyone else. That version of you was extraordinary in its capacity, but it was operating without the one thing that turns capacity into power: discernment. And discernment, unlike most things, cannot be taught. It can only be earned. You earned it the hard way, but you earned it completely, and no one can take it from you now. Think about what you are carrying today that you were not carrying when those people first came into your life. You know, with absolute precision, what it feels like when a connection is genuine versus when it is convenient. You know it in your body before your mind is finished processing the data. You know the specific texture of someone who shows up for you versus someone who shows up for what you provide. You know the difference between a person who respects your boundaries because they respect you and a person who performs respect only until they believe they have earned enough access to stop performing it. You know these things not because someone told you, not because you read about them, but because you live the contrast at a level of intimacy that left no room for ambiguity. That knowledge is not trauma. It is intelligence, hard-won, embodied, unshakable intelligence that will protect you for the rest of your life. And here is what that intelligence has already begun to do. It has started filtering your world in real time, without effort, without the exhausting conscious deliberation that used to accompany every relational decision. People who are consistent feel different to you now. You recognize the ease of it, the way real reciprocity does not require management or interpretation. People who are performing feel different too. There is a specific quality to attention that is angled toward extraction, and you feel it now almost immediately, the way you once only felt it in retrospect after the damage was done. Your nervous system has been recalibrated by everything you survived. It is no longer naively open. It is intelligently open, which means it can still feel everything, still connect deeply, still love with the full force of who you are. But now there is a layer of perception operating underneath all of that feeling, quiet and constant, that keeps watch in a way the old version of you was never able to do. This is what they gave you. This is the unintended inheritance of every person who underestimated you, every relationship that took without giving, every dynamic that treated your emotional generosity as a resource to be used rather than a gift to be honored. They gave you the one thing that genuine love and easy reciprocity might never have forced you to develop. an unbreakable relationship with your own judgment. You trust yourself now in a way that is simply not available to people who have never had to fight their way back to their own instincts. You have been to the bottom of what it costs to abandon yourself, and you came back from it. And now self-abandonment is simply not an option you can choose unconsciously. You would feel it too quickly. You would recognize the pattern too early. You would make a different choice before the cost had time to accumulate, because, with the intimacy of lived experience, exactly what that cost feels like when it finally comes due. So when people speak about what was done to you, when they frame this story as one of damage, of betrayal, of a good person who has taken advantage of you, can afford to let them have that framing, because you know the fuller truth. Yes, you were taken advantage of. Yes, the people involved behaved in ways that were careless at best and cruel at worst. Yes, you deserve better than what you received in every instance, without exception. All of that is true, and none of it needs to be minimized or reframed into something more palatable. You do not need to pretend it did not hurt. You do not need to perform forgiveness you have not fully arrived at. You do not need to rush yourself toward grace for people who have not demonstrated they deserve it. But alongside all of that truth sits another truth that is equally real and far more powerful. They tried to break you, and instead they broke open something in you that had never fully been reached before. They pushed you past every comfortable limit until you discovered that your limits were not where you thought they were. They forced you into a depth of self-examination that most people spend their entire lives successfully avoiding. And what you found in that depth was not weakness, was not damage, was not a version of yourself diminished by what you had endured. What you found was the core of you, clear and solid and entirely undestroyable, waiting patiently beneath all the layers of accommodation and self-erasure and hope that had accumulated over years of loving people who did not know how to love you back. That core does not break. It never broke. They thought they were breaking you, and they were only ever breaking away everything that was not you, every habit of smallness, every reflex of appeasement, every tendency to make yourself easier to digest for people whose capacity was always too limited for what you were offering. What remained after all of that was stripped away is what you are now. And what you are now is not a healed version of a broken person. You are an elevated version of someone who was always this, who just needed the pressure to reveal it. They did not break you. They could not break you. They tried consistently, thoroughly, and without fully understanding what they were dealing with and what they built in their failure to destroy you. Is someone who will never again be available for the kind of dynamic that gave them access in the first place. Someone whose standards are now so clearly defined by lived experience that manipulation has no entry point. Someone who can love freely and fully and without apology, but only toward people who have demonstrated through consistency and honesty and real reciprocity that they are capable of receiving that love without exploiting it. You are not the person they broke. You are the person they built. And whoever comes into your life from this point forward will not be encountering someone who gives endlessly without condition. They will be encountering someone who gives powerfully, wisely, and only ever from a place of genuine choice. That is not a closing. That is not bitterness dressed up as strength. That is what it looks like when an empath finally, fully, without reservation, comes home to themselves. And home, once found, is a place you never have to leave again.